11. This is interval signal number 11.
At the tone, 19 hours, 3 minutes, coordinated universal time. At the tone, 19 hours, 3 minutes, coordinated universal time. At the tone, 19 hours, 3 minutes, coordinated universal time.
This is interval signal number 12.
My name is Derek Parker. This is a true story. It's a story that spans 2 decades from my hometown of Glen Falls, New York in the summer of 1983, all the way to Anchorage, Alaska in 2007. A documentary was made about it in 1999, but it was sensationalized and missed the point entirely. The filmmakers had their own ideas about what made a good story, and the truth got twisted in ways that still bother me. So now, I'm telling it again, just as I remember it. I need to lay it all out, for my own sake, to see if it makes any more sense this time around. I apologize if this version of the story offends anyone who was involved, and I understand if some parts of this story feel difficult to believe, but I promise that this is exactly how I experienced these events. This is the story of the disappearance of Maddie Longbaugh. The summer of 1983 was shaping up to be like any other in Glen Falls. School had let out in early June, and the whole neighborhood had that lazy and endless feel that only comes when you're 15 and the world seems to stop for 3 months. The Longbaughs lived right next door to us. Tyler, who was my age and my best friend at the time, his older sister Cheryl, who'd come home from the University of South Carolina for the summer, and 9-year-old Maddie. My younger sister Amanda was also great friends with Maddie, which meant our families were constantly in and out of each other's homes. Both of our parents worked during the day, my dad at the paper mill and my mom at the bank, while the Longbaughs were both teachers who picked up summer jobs to make ends meet. That meant Tyler and I were constantly stuck watching our younger sisters, which wasn't exactly how we'd planned to spend our summer break. Cheryl was supposed to help us out, but she had other priorities. She disappeared for days at a time, claiming she was meeting friends from high school, leaving us to handle babysitting duties ourselves. Not that Maddie was much trouble, really. She was the kind of kid who could entertain herself for hours, and Amanda would usually tag along with whatever Maddie was doing. That summer, Maddie had become obsessed with her radio. It wasn't even her radio, technically. Tyler had gotten a Sony ICF 7600 for Christmas a couple years back, one of those fancy shortwave radios that could pick up signals from all around the world. Tyler had been excited about it for maybe a week before losing interest entirely, but Maddie had claimed it as her own and carried it everywhere. She'd sit on the front steps or in the back garden, slowly turning the dial, listening to whatever she could find. Amanda would tell me about how Maddie spent an entire afternoon hunting for news stations, writing down frequencies in a little notebook she kept. She found some station out of Montreal that played nothing but jazz, and another one that seemed to broadcast weather reports for ships at sea. I remember thinking it was a bit odd for a 9-year-old to be so fascinated by radio static and beeping sounds, but Maddie was always a curious kid. She had always had a way of lashing on to things. I remember the morning of June 14th quite clearly. Maddie wouldn't shut up about some interval signal contest she was playing to participate in that night. She was practically bouncing off the walls, clutching that radio and going on and on about the contest. She kept explaining the whole thing to Amanda, who was politely pretending to understand. An interval signal, Maddie told us in her matter-of-fact 9-year-old way, was like a musical signature that radio stations played between programs or during breaks. Each station had its own unique tune or sounds, a few notes, sometimes a melody, sometimes just electronic beeps in a particular pattern. It was how you could identify which station you were listening to, especially on shortwaves where signals would drift in and out. The contest part was what had Maddie so excited. Apparently, some stations would run these competitions where they'd play a series of different interval signals throughout the night, and listeners would have to identify as many as they could. You'd write down what you'd heard, match it to the correct station, and send in your answers. Winners got prizes which were usually just certificates or station stickers, but Maddie talked about it like it was the World Series. Tyler decided that morning would be the perfect time to mess with his little sister. He announced that he needed the radio back because the Yankees were playing the Indians that night, and he wanted to listen to the game. I knew this was complete bullshit since we watched nearly every Yankees game on TV in our living room. But he kept it up with a straight face, telling Maddie she'd have to find something else to do. Nothing could break Maddie's excitement that day, though. She just rolled her eyes at Tyler like she'd learned from Cheryl, and told him he could listen to his stupid baseball game any other night. But contests only happened once, she explained patiently. After Tyler and I watched the game that night, I was in my bedroom when the phone rang at 11:15. I could hear my mother's voice from downstairs, then footsteps moving quickly throughout the house. She was calling Maddie's name, checking the kitchen, the living room, even the basement. I knew something was wrong before she even knocked on my door. She told me that Mrs. Longbaugh had called, asking if Maddie was at the house. She wasn't. My mother was already pulling on her shoes when she told me to get dressed, and that we were going to help look for her. 10 minutes later, we were outside with flashlights, walking through the streets of our neighborhood, calling Maddie's name into the darkness. I figured we'd find her pretty quickly. Maybe she'd just wandered into someone's backyard trying to get a better signal on her radio. I remember thinking we'd probably find her sitting somewhere with that radio pressed to her ear, completely oblivious to the panic she'd caused. But as more neighbors started appearing with flashlights, joining the search, I realized it was more serious. Mrs. Henderson from down the street showed up in her bathrobe. The Hamwins brought their German Shepherd. Even old Mr. Yelich, who barely spoke to anyone, was walking the tree line behind his house, calling Maddie's name. By midnight, the police cars started arriving. Chief Frank Kowalski showed up first, then 2 more squad cars from county. The search had suddenly become official, and I could see the worry etched on every adult's face. Tyler and I decided to search the woods behind our houses, the places we knew better than anyone. We'd spent countless afternoons building forts and exploring those trails, and if Maddie had wandered off with a radio trying to find better reception, that's where she would have went. We knew every fallen log, every creek bed, every clearing where the trees opened up enough to see the sky. We walked those familiar paths with our flashlights, calling her name until our voices went hoarse. Tyler kept saying she'd probably just fallen asleep somewhere. Then we find her curled up against the tree with that damn radio still clutched in her hands. But as we searched deeper into the woods, checking every spot we could think of, that hope started to fade.
Interval signal number 12. interval signal number 13. Interval signal.
We searched through the night, and before I knew it, the morning sun was beginning to rise through the trees. I was exhausted and my voice was completely shot from calling Maddie's name. More people had joined us as word spread through the town. By dawn, there must have been 50 neighbors and volunteers walking through the streets. I started hearing more people talk about how the search needed to become more organized and coordinated. Someone mentioned they were setting up a command hub at the local high school gymnasium, where volunteers could check in and get assigned specific areas. When I left the woods that morning, I joined up with a group of volunteers who were heading out to search near the Halfway Brook Reservoir to the north. I remember struggling to visualize how Maddie could have possibly gotten that far on her own, especially in the dark, but I went with them anyway, because at that point we were just grasping at anything. On the way to the reservoir, a couple more people caught up with our group, and they immediately started talking about something that caught us all off guard. They said they'd heard that someone named Raymond Brennan had been already detained by police. I didn't know who that was at the time, and when I asked, they couldn't tell me much beyond the name and that the cops had taken him in for questioning. The information was sketchy and seemed to be coming through third hand through the neighborhood gossip chain, but it was the first real development anyone had mentioned since the search began. We spent an hour and a half searching around the reservoir, walking the shoreline and checking the small boat dock where locals launched their canoes. I couldn't shake this feeling that she wasn't there, like we were wasting precious time looking in the wrong place entirely. Something in my gut told me Maddie wouldn't have come this far from home, especially in the dark with just her radio. Finally, I broke away from the group and started walking back toward town by myself. I needed to know if there had been any other updates or if they'd found anything else. When I reached back near a house, I spotted my father standing in the driveway talking to one of the police officers. I walked over hoping he might have some news or updates about the search, but when I asked him, he seemed to know even less than I did. He told me I needed to go back inside the house and get something to eat, maybe rest for a little while before heading out to search again. I could tell from the way he said it that it wasn't really a suggestion, and I was too exhausted to argue anyway. Despite the knot in my stomach that had been there since last night, I realized I was absolutely starving. The constant searching had burned through whatever energy I had left, and my hands were actually shaking as I walked through the kitchen. I pulled out some bread and started making myself a sandwich. I could see the TV from where I stood in the kitchen and saw a local news reporter who was standing in front of what looked like some kind of industrial building, talking directly into the camera. I caught the tail end of whatever she was saying and heard the name Raymond Brennan again. I turned up the volume and sat down on the edge of the sofa. The reporter was explaining that Raymond Brennan, a 72-year-old local man, had been detained by police in connection with Maddie's disappearance. She described him as someone who operated an amateur radio station as a hobby at an old converted water treatment building somewhere in town near West Mountain. The camera panned to show the building behind her. It was perched on a hill and had this distinctive circular silver exterior that caught the morning sunlight. They cut to a live shot from outside of the building. I could see the police cars parked nearby. The reporter mentioned that authorities had already conducted a thorough search of the premises, though she didn't go into detail about what they may have found or taken away. They kept using careful language, saying he was being questioned in connection with the case, but they never actually came out and said what evidence or suspicion had led police to him. The whole thing felt frustratingly vague. As they cut to commercial, I could feel my eyes almost shutting on their own. I told myself I'd close them just for a minute, maybe take a quick 1-hour nap, and then I'd get back out there on my feet to continue searching for Maddie. But when I finally opened my eyes again, the afternoon sun was pouring in through the living room window, hitting me right in the face. I sat up with a start, completely disoriented, and I looked around at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 4:30 in the afternoon, and I had been asleep for over 5 hours. I rubbed my eyes and looked back at the television, which was still on. The local news was running what looked like a replay of an earlier broadcast. I could see Police Chief Frank Kowalski again, standing behind a podium that had been set up somewhere outdoors. Kowalski looked tired. He was a heavy-set man with gray hair and glasses, someone I'd seen around town my whole life but never really paid much attention to until now. He was announcing that search teams had found one of Maddie's shoes in an open field about 2 miles from her house. The shoe had been discovered earlier that afternoon by volunteers who were searching areas that hadn't been covered during the overnight search. Kowalski held up what looked like a small pink sneaker that I recognized instantly. He explained that the shoe had been found in a field near Upper Sherman Ave, which was quite a distance from our neighborhood. The area was being treated as a potential crime scene, he said, and they were asking all search volunteers to avoid that particular field while investigators processed it for additional evidence. Despite this development, Kowalski emphasized that the search was continuing and that they still needed the public's help. He gave out a phone number for people to call if they had any information and reminded everyone that even the smallest detail might be important. I walked back outside around 5 that afternoon, still groggy from the unexpected sleep. The sky was completely clear, one of those perfect June days, and the contrast with the town's mood felt almost cruel. I walked through the quiet streets, looking for any group I could join to continue searching. Eventually, I found a small one gathered at the edge of the woods near Maple Street, and I recognized my father among them. They were preparing to search a section of forest that bordered the elementary school. When I approached, my father looked surprised to see me. I told the group that Tyler and I had already searched through most of these woods the night before, and that we covered every trail and clearing we could think of. My father listened and then told everyone that they should look again anyway, that maybe we'd missed something in the dark, or there might be areas we hadn't thought to check the first time around. We spent the next few hours combing through sections of the forest I thought we'd already covered. After several hours of this, we ended up emerging on the far side of the woods, somewhere I'd never come out of before. We found ourselves standing at the edge of someone's backyard, looking at a modest ranch house with a well-maintained garden. One of the men in our search group mentioned it belonged to him. Seeing how exhausted we all looked, he invited us inside to rest for a moment and get some water. The house was quiet and cool inside, a relief after hours of walking through humid summer woods. He led us to his kitchen and started pulling glasses from a cabinet, filling them with ice water from the refrigerator. As we stood there in his kitchen trying to catch our breath, I noticed that there was a small television sitting on the counter. The volume was turned down low, but I could see it was tuned to the local news. It seemed like television had become the only reliable way to get information about what was happening with the search. The homeowner must have noticed me watching the screen because he reached over and turned up the volume. A female reporter was standing outside what I now recognize as the Glen Falls Police Department. In a significant development in the search for 9-year-old Maddie Longbaugh, police have formally arrested 72-year-old Raymond Brennan in connection with her disappearance. I felt my stomach drop as I watched the reporter utter those words. The other searchers in the kitchen had stopped talking and were all focused on the television now. Brennan, who operates an amateur radio station from his home, was initially detained yesterday for questioning. However, sources close to the investigation tell us that inconsistencies in his original statement to police have led to formal charges being filed. According to our sources, when Brennan was first questioned, His account of his whereabouts on the night of June 14th placed him in the vicinity of a field where Maddie's shoe was discovered yesterday afternoon. While Brennan continues to maintain his innocence, police felt they had sufficient cause to make an arrest. The camera cut to a shot at the police station where several official-looking cars were parked outside. Brennan is currently being held without bond, pending further investigation. Police Chief Frank Kowalski is expected to hold another press conference tomorrow morning to update the public on the case. The reporter wrapped up by reminding viewers about the tip line and asking anyone with information to contact authorities immediately. One of the men in the group set down his glass and asked the question that was probably on everyone's mind. How was simply being near that area cause enough to arrest someone? I remember thinking the same thing, but I couldn't add it up either.
Interval signal number 13. Interval signal number 13. This is interval signal number 14. Interval signal number 14.
Woke up the next morning to my father shaking my shoulder gently, telling me the police wanted to speak to me down at the station. He was already dressed and had that careful, measured tone parents use when they're trying not to worry you about something that's clearly worrying them. He explained that they simply wanted to see if I could offer anything helpful, that they were talking to all the kids in the neighborhood who knew Maddie well. I wasn't surprised, really. In fact, I'd been wondering why it had taken this long. My sister and I were probably closer to the Longbaugh family than anyone else on the street. We'd spent countless hours in their house. We knew their routines and their habits. If anyone might have noticed something unusual about Maddie's behavior, or picked up on some detail that could help, it would be us. The drive to the police station felt longer than it actually was. My father kept the radio on low, some talk show droning on in the background, but neither of us were really listening. I stared out the window at the familiar streets of Glen Falls, everything looking exactly the same as it had always been, which somehow made the whole situation feel even more surreal. The Glen Falls police station building looked older in person, like it had been built sometime in the 50s and never updated. My father and I walked through the glass doors into a small lobby with pale lighting that made everything look institutional. A receptionist sat behind the thick glass and directed us to wait on hard plastic chairs until someone came to get me. When the door finally opened, it wasn't a local cop, but a man in a dark suit who introduced himself as Agent Morrison from the FBI. He was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with short black hair and the kind of serious expression that made you feel like you'd done something wrong, even when you hadn't. He shook my father's hand and told him he needed to speak with me alone, that it was standard procedure for witness interviews. Agent Morrison led me down a narrow hallway to a small room with a metal table and 3 chairs. There was a tape recorder sitting in the center of the table that he turned on after we sat down. He started with basic questions about how well I knew Maddie, how often a family spent time together, whether I'd noticed anything unusual about her behavior in the days before she disappeared. After the initial questions, Agent Morrison shifted forward slightly, and his tone became more focused. He asked me about specifically Maddie's radio obsession, whether I'd noticed her talking about unusual broadcasts and weeks before she disappeared. I told him about the interval signal contest she'd been so excited about and how she'd been practicing for weeks, writing down frequencies and station signatures in that little notebook of hers. I explained how determined she'd been to participate that night. Morrison nodded and made notes as I spoke. He asked if Maddie had ever mentioned meeting anyone through her radio hobby, or if she'd talked about specific stations or operators she'd been in contact with. I told him no, that as far as I knew, she was just a listener to whatever she could find. Then he opened a manila folder and pulled out several pieces of paper, spreading them across the table between us. They were photocopies of drawings clearly done by a child with crayons or colored pencils. The first drawing showed two crude stick figures, one smaller one colored in pink and another taller one in black, standing next to what looked like a large silver circular disc-shaped object. The proportions were all wrong, the way kids' drawings always are, but there was something about that silver circle that immediately brought Raymond's building to mind. The one that I'd seen on the news with its distinctive metallic exterior. Agent Morrison watched my face carefully as I studied the drawing. He asked if anything about it looked familiar to me, if Maddie had ever mentioned or described anything like what she'd drawn. I looked around at the other drawings spread across the table. They all seemed to depict something similar. The same silver circular structure, the same pink stick figure that had to be Maddie herself. But in some of them, there were more black stick figures, sometimes 3 or 4 of them standing around the pink one. Morrison explained that they'd found these drawings in Maddie's bedroom, tucked away in the same notebook where she'd been writing down radio frequencies. He wanted to know if I'd ever seen her working on them, or if she'd mentioned what they were supposed to represent. I told him that I hadn't seen the drawings before, but that the silver building did remind me of Raymond's radio station from the news coverage. Morrison nodded and made another note, and then he asked if Maddie had ever talked about meeting other people who were interested in radio, or if she'd mentioned to anyone else who might have been helping her with the contest. Before I could answer, Agent Morrison leaned back in his chair and explained that one of the biggest challenges that they faced was the nature of shortwave radio itself. Unlike commercial AM or FM stations that kept detailed logs of their programming, shortwave frequencies were largely unregulated, especially the amateur operators in international broadcasts that Maddie seemed to prefer. There were no comprehensive recordings of what had been transmitted on any given night, no way to go back and listen to what she might have heard during those crucial hours. He said they needed to understand exactly what Maddie had been listening to that night, what specific signals or stations she might have encountered while participating in that contest. The problem was that without recordings, they were relying entirely on witness accounts and whatever notes she might have left behind. Morrison asked if I could remember any specific frequencies Maddie had mentioned, any particular stations she'd talked about discovering, or any unusual broadcasts she described in the days leading up to her disappearance. I had to admit that I simply didn't know. While I'd been aware of her radio obsession, I'd never really paid close attention to the technical details she'd been so excited about. I couldn't remember her mentioning specific frequencies or call signs, and I'd never looked at that notebook where she'd been writing down everything. After a few more questions, Agent Morrison eventually led me back out to the lobby where my father was waiting. The agent shook my father's hand and thanked him for bringing me in, and told us we could leave. We walked back through those glass doors, and I felt like I was stepping out of some strange alternate reality. My father and I got back into the car and began driving home in complete silence. The weight of everything I'd just heard in that interview sat heavy between us. I couldn't tell if he was letting me process it all, but after a few minutes, I asked if we could just listen to the radio. He reached over and turned it on, tuning it to the local AM station that had been covering the story most thoroughly. For a while, there was just the regular programming, but then the familiar sound of a news bulletin came through the speakers.
This is WGFL News Radio with a breaking update on the Maddie Longbaugh case. We've just learned that a local radio engineer has come forward with what may be crucial evidence in the investigation. According to sources at the Glen Falls Police Department, Thomas Whitman, a broadcast engineer at WKNY-AM, contacted authorities this morning with a cassette recording from the night of June 14th. Whitman explains that as part of standard FCC logging procedures, he routinely records overnight air feeds for compliance purposes. On the tape from that night, which was supposed to contain only WKNY's broadcast of the Yankees-Indians game, investigators have discovered what appears to be signal bleed over from an unknown shortwave transmission. This transmission includes portions of what sounds like the very interval signal contest that 9-year-old Maddie Longbaugh was planning to participate in. Police have confirmed they are currently analyzing the tape with FBI technical specialists. We understand the recording contains unusual content that investigators believe may be directly related to Maddie's disappearance. Some listeners may find the following content disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
Signal number 14. Signal number 15. Interval signal number 15. Please run outside and find the lights in the sky. Please run outside and find the lights in the sky. Please run outside and find the lights in the sky. Please run outside and find the lights in the sky.
Over the next few weeks, the public's reaction to that recording was all over the place. Some people were furious that the radio station had even aired it, arguing that they already had Raymond in custody and that playing something so disturbing was just sensationalism. Others didn't know what to make of it all, couldn't decide if it was evidence or just some sick coincidence. The phone lines at the police station lit up with calls from people claiming they'd heard similar transmissions or had information about unusual radioactivity, but none of it led anywhere useful. Most callers were prank calls or well-meaning folks who'd convinced themselves they remembered something that probably never happened. A few reported seeing strange lights in the sky that night, but their stories were scattered and contradictory. The recordings had become this thing that everyone in town had an opinion about, but nobody could actually explain what it meant or how it was connected to what happened to Maddie. The weeks stretched into months, The flyers with her picture that had been taped to every storefront window started fading into the sun. By September, most folks seemed to accept that Maddie Longbaugh was never coming home. But then something happened that caught everyone off guard. In early November, Chief Kowalski announced that Raymond Brennan's trial would begin in December, just 6 months after Maddie's disappearance. People were surprised it was happening so fast. Most expected these things to drag on for years, with appeals and delays and all the legal maneuvering you've always heard about on the news. The speed of it made some folks uncomfortable, like maybe the authorities were rushing to judgment because they needed someone to blame. Others figured the case must be stronger than anyone realized if they were this confident enough to move forward with it so quickly. The trial began on December 3rd, 1983, and I attended every day. I needed to see for myself what evidence they actually had against Raymond Brennan. The courthouse was this grand old building from the 1920s with marble floors and high ceilings that made every sound echo. The gallery was packed each day with townspeople, reporters, and anyone else who could get a seat. I usually sat in the back, watching everything unfold. The first thing that struck me about Raymond was how frail he looked. All the talk around the town had built him up as this sinister figure, but sitting at the defendant's table, he just looked like a scared old man. He was tall and thin, probably about 6'2", but couldn't have weighed more than 160 pounds. His gray hair was thinning and unkempt. His hand shook slightly whenever he reached for his water glass. The dark suit he wore hung loose on his frame, like he'd borrowed it from someone larger. His defense attorney was a sharp woman named Patricia Coleman from Albany, who came out swinging straight from the start. Her opening argument was focused entirely on a reasonable doubt, specifically how flimsy the evidence actually was. Coleman's first major challenge was getting that recording thrown out entirely. She argued that there was absolutely no way to prove the transmission was connected to Maddie's disappearance. Anyone with basic shortwave equipment could have made that broadcast, she pointed out. The prosecution couldn't even prove that Raymond owned the right type of transmitter to create that signal. She hammered this point relentlessly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Coleman told the jury, "shortwave radio transmissions don't come up with a return address. This recording could have originated from anywhere within a 1,000-mile radius. It could have been made by anyone with $50 worth of equipment and a twisted sense of humor." The prosecution tried to argue that the timing was too coincidental, that this disturbing transmission occurred on the exact night Maddie went missing, during the exact contest she was planning to participate in. When the prosecution called Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a child psychologist, to testify about Maddie's drawings, Holman was ready for that too. Dr. Mitchell had examined the sketches of stick figures standing near silver circular structures and concluded that they showed a clear connection to Raymond's radio building. But Coleman brought her own expert, Dr. James Hartwell from Syracuse University, who testified that children often drew circles to represent any number of round structures. They could be water towers, silos, playground equipment, even the moon. He pointed out that Maddie lived in a small town surrounded by farms and industrial buildings, any of which could have inspired those drawings. "A 9-year-old draws a circle," Coleman said during cross-examination, "and suddenly we're supposed to believe it's evidence of a crime?" Where things got more serious for Raymond was when the prosecution called his neighbors to testify. Mrs. Helen Vasquez, who lived about a quarter mile from Raymond's place, swore she'd seen his beat-up Ford pickup truck parked in unusual locations during the week before Maddie's disappearance. She testified that on June 12th, she'd spotted his truck along Route 9, about halfway between his house and the field where Maddie's shoe was eventually found. The next night, June 13th, she claimed to have seen the same truck parked near the elementary school around 10 p.m., which was well past when anyone would normally be there. But even this testimony had problems. During cross-examination, Coleman got Mrs. Vasquez to admit it had been dark both times, that she'd only seen a glimpse of the truck from a distance, and that she couldn't be absolutely certain it was Raymond's vehicle. Lots of people in Glen Falls drove old Ford pickups, Coleman pointed out. The prosecution's case really hinged on Raymond's own statements to police. When he'd been first questioned, he'd told investigators that he had no idea why he'd been to that field that night on June 14th. He said he'd driven out there around 10:30 p.m., parked his truck, and walked around for maybe 20 minutes before going home. Under questioning, he kept saying he'd felt drawn to the area, that something had compelled him to drive out there, but he couldn't quite articulate what that something was. "I just had this feeling," Raymond testified in his own defense. "Like I needed to be there. I can't explain it better than that. I drove out there and I walked around the field for a bit, and then I went home. I didn't see any little girl. I didn't see anything unusual at all." The prosecution painted this as the vague, unconvincing story of a guilty man trying to explain away his presence at the crime scene. District Attorney Robert Shaw argued that Raymond had lured Maddie there using his radio equipment, and when pressed about why he'd been there, he concocted this story about feeling mysteriously drawn to the location. But the defense argued that Raymond's inability to explain his presence actually supported his innocence. If he were guilty, she contended, wouldn't he have prepared a better alibi? Wouldn't he have made up some reasonable explanation for being in that field? The weirdest part of the whole trial came when the defense started calling witnesses who'd claimed they'd seen strange lights in the sky on June 14th. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh testified she'd seen 3 bright lights moving in a formation across the sky around midnight. Carl Morrison claimed he'd observed a single bright light hovering over the woods behind his house for nearly 10 minutes. The problem was that none of these people had reported seeing lights until the recordings became public. The prosecution pointed this out repeatedly during cross-examination, noting how convenient it was that all these witnesses suddenly remembered such remarkable events only after hearing of the radio transmission that specifically mentioned lights in the sky. On the final day, the defense gave their closing arguments. "Members of the jury, we've seen children's drawings that could represent anything around. We've listened to a recording that could have been made by anyone, anywhere. And through it all, the prosecution has failed to present a single piece of physical evidence connecting my client to this crime. The only thing the prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt is that Raymond Brennan was in a field on the night Maddie Longbaugh disappeared. But being in a field isn't a crime. Feeling mysteriously drawn to a place isn't a crime. And drawing circles certainly isn't evidence of anything criminal." In that moment, I felt almost certain that Raymond would get to go home that day. Yet, we were made to wait for 3 days of deliberation until the jury came back with a verdict that shocked everyone. Guilty. Sitting in the courtroom when the foreman read those words, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Based on everything I'd witnessed during the trial, it seemed like an impossible conclusion. The prosecution's case had felt flimsy at best, full of circumstantial evidence and wild theories that Coleman had dismantled. In the gallery around us, there were gasps and murmurs, with some people shaking their heads in disbelief. Raymond himself just sat there at the defendant's table, staring straight ahead with no expression at all. That night, I watched the local news coverage, trying to make sense of what had happened. Most of the reporters seemed as surprised as everyone else. They interviewed legal experts and courtroom observers, all trying to explain how the jury could convict based on what everyone agreed was a weak case. But then, one expert, a law professor from Connecticut, said something that made it all click into place. He explained that toward the end of the trial, when the defense had brought forward those witnesses claiming to have seen unusual lights in the sky, he had actually backfired on Coleman. The defense attorney never really explained what she was suggesting with those witnesses, the professor said. She put people on the stand who talked about strange lights, but then didn't follow through with any coherent theories about what those lights might have been or how they were connected to the case. From the jury's perspective, it probably looked like the defense was grasping at straws, trying to muddy the waters with bizarre conspiracy theories. He continued, "The jury likely saw those witnesses as evidence that the defense had no real explanation for what happened, which made the prosecution's straightforward theory that Raymond Brennan was simply a guilty man with a weak alibi seem more credible by comparison." Raymond was sentenced to 25 years to life. The judge called it a heinous crime against an innocent child, and he hoped that the sentence would bring some measure of peace to the Longbaugh family and the Glen Falls community. But I don't think anyone really felt that justice had been done for Maddie. The conviction felt hollow and like we'd all participated in some elaborate performance where everyone played their roles but nobody really truly believed in the ending. The trial had answered none of the real questions about what had happened that night. We still didn't know how Maddie had ended up in that field, what had become of her, or why someone had broadcast that disturbing message about lights in the sky. All we had was an old man in prison and a community that desperately wanted to believe that the nightmare was over. By 2006, 23 years after Maddie's disappearance, the story had taken on a life of its own. There was a feature-length documentary called Signals in the Dark that premiered at some film festival and eventually made its way to cable television. It had a slick production value, dramatic reenactments with child actors, and talking head interviews with investigators and townspeople who had barely known Maddie at all. They'd also featured the case on 3 different true crime television shows: Unsolved Mysteries, America's Most Wanted, and some program on the Discovery Channel about unexplained disappearances. Each one had their own angle and their own theory about what really happened that night in 1983. The Longbaugh family tried to fight the release of most of these programs, hiring lawyers to block the documentary and sending cease and desist letters to the television networks. But there wasn't much they could do legally. The case was public record, and the filmmakers had been careful to avoid saying anything that could be considered libelous. But what bothered me most was how each retelling seemed to drift further and further from what had actually occurred. The documentary spent 20 minutes on the mysterious radio transmission and barely mentioned that Raymond Brennan had been convicted on what any reasonable person could see was flimsy evidence. They'd interviewed people who claimed to be experts on shortwave radio frequencies, brought in former military personnel to speculate about classified aircraft testing, and somehow managed to transform a 9-year-old girl's disappearance into fodder for conspiracy theorists. It was disgusting, really, watching Maddie's story get twisted into entertainment for people who just wanted to believe in something mysterious and unexplained. But despite how repulsive I found it all, or maybe even because of that, I found myself becoming obsessed with the coverage of her disappearance. It was like watching a car crash and I couldn't look away. I developed a habit of reading this forum called Open Index, where several people would discuss Maddie's disappearance every few weeks. The forum had been around since the late 90s, and by 2006 it had accumulated hundreds of posts about the case, with new theories and supposed evidence appearing regularly. I participated anonymously, spending hours each month reading through the discussions and occasionally contributing my own thoughts. Most of it was conspiratorial nonsense that I felt compelled to debunk. People claiming that the government had covered up alien abductions, others insisting Raymond was innocent because of some elaborate military experiment involving mind control frequencies. The forum attracted every kind of amateur detective and conspiracy theorist you could imagine. There were people who'd mapped out supposed UFO sightings across upstate New York, others who'd analyzed the radio recordings frame by frame looking for hidden messages, and a very vocal group who believed Maddie had been taken by some kind of cult operating through shortwave radio networks. But every once in a while, someone would post something genuinely useful. A retired radio technician had once provided a detailed analysis of the transmission quality that helped narrow down the possible equipment used. Another user had tracked down additional witness statements that never made it into the trial record. The forum became this strange addiction for me, a place where I could engage with Maddie's story without having to reveal my personal connection to it. It was in March of 2007 when the post appeared that changed everything. I was doing my usual late-night scroll through the forum when a new thread caught my attention. The username was Arctic Supply, and the title was simply Possible Connection, Bush Pilot Supply Store. The post was longer than most, written in that careful way that people use when they're not sure if they should be sharing something at all. I'm not sure if this belongs here, and I might be wasting everyone's time, but I felt like I needed to tell this story. I own a Bush Pilot Supply Store in Anchorage. It's a pretty specialized business. We cater to small aircraft operators who need equipment for remote flying, survival gear, radio equipment, that sort of thing. For the past 8 months or so, I've had this woman coming into my shop, maybe 3 or 4 times a month. She's always looking for very specific radio equipment, really niche stuff, and most people wouldn't even know how to use. HF transmitters, antenna analyzers, frequency counters, the kind of gear that serious radio operators use for long-distance communication. At first, I figured she was just another ham radio enthusiast, maybe working on some kind of remote communication setup. We get those types occasionally, but the equipment she was asking for kept getting more and more unusual. She wanted components for building high-frequency arrays, asked about ionospheric propagation enhancers, stuff that went way beyond hobby-level radio work. After a few visits, I asked her what she was trying to accomplish with all this equipment. She said she was trying to recreate the HF transmitters at Gakona at a smaller scale. Now, I thought she was either crazy or pulling my leg. The Gakona facility she was talking about is HARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. It's this massive array of high-frequency transmitters the military uses to study the upper atmosphere. We're talking about millions of watts of transmitted power, antenna arrays that cover acres of land. The idea that someone could recreate that on a small scale seemed completely insane. But then she started explaining exactly how the system works. She described how the giant array of HF transmitters beam intense radio frequency waves into the upper atmosphere to create controlled disturbances, and how those disturbances can affect radio propagation patterns across huge distances. She knew technical details about phase coherence and beam steering that most professional radio engineers don't understand at all. I've been in the radio business for 25 years now, and this woman, who couldn't have been more than 30 years old, was explaining upper atmosphere physics like she'd been studying it her whole life. She told me that she thought she could do it at a much smaller scale, and with the right equipment and setup, she could create localized atmospheric disturbances that would affect shortwave radio signals in a specific geographic area. When I asked her why she would want to do that, she just said she was looking to communicate with someone. The thing is, she kept coming back month after month, always looking for parts I didn't have in stock. I started special ordering equipment for her, and we got to talking more. She mentioned her name was Maddie, and she was originally from New York, but moved away when she was young. She never said where exactly, and I never pressed her on it. But after she mentioned New York, I went back and looked at some of the old photos from the Maddie Longbaugh case that get posted here sometimes. I asked her again what she wanted to accomplish with this equipment, and she gave me the same answer as before. She was just looking to communicate with someone. When I pushed her on who, she just said it was complicated and changed the subject. Look, I'm not saying this is definitely the same person. I'm probably wrong, and I feel stupid even for posting this, but it all seems like it's too much of a coincidence. I'm not at all convinced this is anything, but I felt compelled to tell the story. I read that post 3 times before the full implications hit me. Over the next few days, the thread exploded. Dozens of users were begging Arctic Supply to post a photo of the woman, offering to analyze facial structure, and asking for more details about her appearance and behavior. Some people were convinced there was a hoax. Others thought it might be the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. For several weeks, Arctic Supply didn't respond to any of the requests. The thread just kept growing, with users bumping it daily, pleading for more information, and I started checking the forum obsessively, refreshing the page multiple times each day to see if anything new was posted. I began to think the whole thing was fake. Just another attention-seeking post from someone who wanted to stir up controversy on the forum. It wouldn't have been the first time someone claimed to have seen Maddie alive somewhere. But then, 6 weeks after the original post, Arctic Supply finally responded. I know everyone's been asking for a photo, and I've been going back and forth about whether to post this one. I took this picture with my phone a few weeks ago when she was in the store, looking for some antenna equipment. She didn't know I was taking it. I was pretending to check something on my phone while she was studying a frequency analyzer manual. I'm still not convinced this means anything, but here's the photo. Make of it what you will. The image loaded slowly on my computer screen, revealing a candid shot of a woman in her late 20s or early 30s, standing at what looked like an electronics shop. She was wearing a dark jacket and had shoulder-length brown hair. She was looking down at something in her hands, but it was her face that made my heart stop. I sat there staring at that photo for what felt like hours, my mind racing through 24 years of questions that might actually finally be answered. Maddie was alive. She was in Alaska.